More now on our top story, the G7 summit in the UK. Joining us from London is Klisman Murati, founder and CEO of Pangaea Wire Group, a geopolitical consultancy. Good to have you with us, sir. So China's Belt and Road Initiative is to get some competition. It's about 7 years too late, isn't it?
Well, you're right in saying that China's Belt and Road Initiative is only one sort of piece of the puzzle in China's wish to be the dominant nation in the world. Now, the G7 have come up with a proposal without any legs on it as yet, but it's too late in the making, I do believe. And also what they need to be thinking about is the funding aspect and also the wider vision aspect, which they haven't really solidified as it stands.
G7 is supposed to be a grouping of the world's top industrialized nations, the richest nations in the world, but are they, the US aside, the world's most powerful and influential nations?
I would say no, and this goes back to our global power index, which we created, which maps nations on their globalized power, on their centers of power. And from our analysis, from the top 7 nations that we ranked, only 2 of them make the top list, that being the US and Canada. Other nations, including Brazil, Mexico, and China, are also in the list, but these nations aren't mentioned as much. And I think if you are going to look into the future to find out where power lies and where influence lies, I think you need to look beyond the G7, which is mostly an ideological grouping of liberal democracies. But where the real fundamental power lies is not within that grouping as it stands today, nor will it be in the future.
So is the G7 set to become irrelevant, do you think? I mean, to get anything done globally, you've got to include these other powerful, influential nations.
I think, Adrian, the way the world is now is that you have the liberal democracies of the world, which is represented in short term by the G7, although there are more than obviously 7 democratic nations in the world. And then you have the fledgling nations, which are developing, but they don't have an ideology like liberal democracy at their disposal, which they want to promote. And in the middle of these 2, you have a chasm of no power or no alternative. China, although is slowly filling that chasm up, which is why China is seen as a very domineering power and the only major challenger to the international world order which we have today.
So what's going on with this Build Back Better World initiative? It's the US basically afraid of losing its influence, its geopolitical dominance.
I think Build Back Better is a good slogan. I think it's a slogan that means something to those nations which created it. But the issue that they're going to have is buy-in from other nations to actually, what does this mean in practice for the Zimbabwe's of the world, for the Albanias of the world, and for the developing economies which may hear this message but don't know how they can be part of the development of it, and also what they have to gain from this Build Back Better idea. Because right now what we have is a Build Back Better and really every nation for themselves. So if this Build Back Better were to actually be successful, the nations which promote it need to show in reality what tangible benefits other nations will have if they do buy into this idea,
okay,
and if there's a role that these nations can play.
And one nation we haven't discussed is at length here is Russia, which of course was once a part of what was then the G8. Where does Russia fit into this this geopolitical influence?
I think, if you were to be honest, the G7 would love to have Russia in if they didn't have Putin as their figurehead. If Russia was more towards the liberal democratic side, perhaps they would have a bigger role to play within this grouping of nations. But Russia isn't weakened by them not being involved in the G7 in any way, shape, or form, because they have their own agenda which they want to fulfill, and they see the G7, just like I explained, as an ideological grouping of nations, because the actual power of nations is well beyond the G7. So they may feel perhaps silently disappointed if that's even the case, but really and truly they have their own agendas and they don't need the G7 in order to fulfill them.
Fascinating. Really good to talk to you. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you so much,
Klisman
Richard.
Murati.
Wonderful.